The span of 12 years between Steamboat Willie, the first Mickey with sound, and Fantasia is the bridge between primitive and modern animated pictures. No genius built this bridge. It was built by hard work and enthusiasm, integrity of purpose, a devotion to our medium, confidence in its future, and above all, a steady day-by-day growth in which we all simply studied our trade and learned. Walt Disney, in a speech given in 1940. Welcome to the history of the 20th century. Episode 288. What's up, Doc? Walter Elias Disney was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1901. His father, Elias, was an immigrant from Canada. Walter was the youngest of 4 sons. He also had a younger sister. The family was not prosperous. When Walt was 4, the family moved to a farm in Missouri. When he was 9, they moved to Kansas City, Missouri. There, Elias made Walt and his big brother Roy take on a paper route. They got up at 4:30 in the morning to deliver the morning Kansas City Times before school, and then after school another round to deliver the evening Kansas City Star. This was the first business partnership between Roy and Walt. It would not be the last. They kept this up for 6 years, and it made Walt a poor student who often fell asleep in class. But he was also taking art classes on the side. He had shown a flair for drawing and painting from an early age, but his real love was cartooning. In 1917, the family moved back to Chicago, where Walt became the cartoonist for his high school newspaper. And as you may recall from episode 172, Walt Disney attempted to enlist in the U.S. Army during the Great War, though he was underage. He forged the date on his birth certificate to persuade the American Red Cross to take him on as an ambulance driver when he was just 16, but fell ill during the influenza pandemic. By the time he recovered and was shipped off to France, the war was over. Walt spent a year in France, during which he published some cartoons in the Army newspaper Stars and Stripes. In October 1919, he returned to the United States and landed a job at a commercial art studio in Kansas City, drawing illustrations for advertisements. There he befriended another young cartoonist, the son of a German immigrant, born Ube Iwerks, although he called himself Ub Iwerks. Unfortunately for them, when the post-war economic downturn began in 1920, they were laid off. After an unsuccessful attempt to create their own studio, the two got a job at a film animation studio that was producing advertisements that were run in local movie houses. Here, they learned the basics of animation. Walt left the studio in 1921 to start his own animation company and soon landed a major client. The Newman Theater, Kansas City's biggest theater. Built in 1919, it had 2,000 seats and an orchestra pit that could accommodate 35 musicians. Disney Studio made animated shorts for the theater, which were dubbed Newman Laughograms. Many of these short films were animated retellings of traditional fairy tales. Perhaps a sign of things to come. Disney Studio grew and took on new animators, including Disney's friend Ub Iwerks. Disney built on the success of the Laughograms to begin a combined live-action and animation short titled Alice's Wonderland, in which a live-action Alice, portrayed by a 4-year-old girl named Virginia Davis, interacts with cartoon characters. But Walt Studio went bankrupt shortly after Alice's Wonderland was completed. After the failure of his Kansas City animation studio, Walt Disney moved to Hollywood, California. It was 1923, and Walt was 21 years old. At this time, Hollywood was the center of live-action filmmaking in the United States, but New York was still the center of animation. There were two reasons why he chose to move to Hollywood. One was that he had family there, including his brother Roy. The other was that Walt had dreams of becoming a live-action filmmaker. He brought Alice's Wonderland along with him and shopped it around until it was picked up by a New York distributor named Margaret Winkler. You may recall this name from last week's episode. She was distributing Felix the Cat for Pat Sullivan. But then Sullivan changed distributors, leaving her suddenly in need of new material. Winkler signed a contract with Disney to produce a series of Alice shorts. Disney persuaded Ub Iwerks and some of their mutual artist friends from Kansas City to make the move to Hollywood to work on the series. He even persuaded the family of Virginia Davis to move to Hollywood so she could reprise her role as Alice. In 1925, Disney hired a secretary named Lillian Bounds. A few months later, she and Walt got married in her hometown of Lewiston, Idaho. They had two children, a biological daughter named Diane and an adopted daughter named Sharon. It appears to have been a happy marriage, though Lillian was not very interested in becoming a public figure, and she kept herself and her children out of the public spotlight. By 1927, the contract for the Alice shorts had run its course. The production schedule had been demanding, and Disney wanted to return to fully animated films. He sold his distributor on a new series of 27 shorts starring an animated rabbit Disney created named Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, to be sold to Universal Pictures. To be perfectly honest, Oswald looked a whole lot like Felix the Cat. He was all black, like Felix, only he lacked the long tail and sported instead long ears, although unlike Felix, he wore clothes, even if they were only a pair of short pants held up by a single suspender. The quality of the Oswald cartoons was a cut above anything Disney, or indeed anyone, had done before. He experimented with using different camera angles on Oswald, as in a live-action film, and Oswald was designed to have a lot more personality. He was animated in a fluid style that would become a Disney trademark, and he was capable of such improbable feats as wringing himself out after getting wet. Much of the credit for the visual humor has to go to Ub Iwerks and to some of those Kansas City artists, notably a fellow named Isidore Freeling, who went by the nickname Frizz. Oswald represented a step forward in animation, and the series was a success. One trade newspaper hailed the new character and marveled that no one had ever thought of a cartoon rabbit before. I wonder if anyone else will ever think of one. Roy was a partner in the studio too. He handled the business end of the operation, and it quickly became profitable. They had 20 employees, and Walt and Roy each owned a home, a car, had money in the bank, and were buying investment properties in Southern California in the 1920s. Oh, to be that lucky. The Oswald cartoons were a hit, but Disney's vision of creating more and better cartoons was running afoul of economics in the late 1920s. The market for cartoon shorts was shrinking, and distributors were paying less and less for lower quality films. Disney's distributor, Margaret Winkler, had gotten married, and her new husband, a man named Charles Mintz, was now running the distribution company. Disney Studio was getting paid $2,250 for each Oswald cartoon. Given the success of the series and its quality and Disney's desire to make them better still, when it was time to renew the distribution agreement, Disney felt comfortable asking for an increase in the fee per film. Mintz made him a counteroffer. Disney would accept a lower fee of just $1,800 per film, or else Mintz would hire away all of Disney's animators and produce Oswald cartoons himself, since their contract specified that Universal, not Disney, owned the rights to the character. Disney refused to accept Mintz's proposal. He didn't believe that his animators would walk out on him like that. But they did. With the exception of his old friend Ub Iwerks, pretty much everyone else jumped ship to work at Charles Mintz's new animation studio, which would eventually be named Screen Gems. Disney was devastated, but he learned his lesson and vowed never again to animate a character he didn't own the rights to. On the long train ride back to Los Angeles, Disney began designing a new cartoon character. There are multiple versions of the story of how this new character came to be, but it seems Disney and Iwerks sketched out potential characters and passed the designs back and forth for refinement. What came out of them was a mouse. This mouse looked an awful lot like Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, who looked an awful lot like Felix the Cat, except the mouse had big round ears instead of Oswald's long skinny ones, and a snout. The mouse wore shorts, just like Oswald, but didn't need the suspender. And he wore shoes. In a few years, he'd be wearing white gloves, too. Disney wanted to call the character Mortimer Mouse, but Lillian persuaded him that Mortimer was too stuffy a name. So he became Mickey Mouse. Disney Studio produced 3 Mickey Mouse cartoon shorts in 1928. Plane Crazy, inspired by Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic flight, Gallopin' Gaucho, and Steamboat Willie. Walt showed off the first 2 cartoons after they were finished, but was unable to interest a distributor. You know from episode 274 that this was just after Warner Brothers released The Jazz Singer. And you know from last week's episode that the most popular cartoon series of the time was Felix the Cat, but that the head of the studio that produced Felix the Cat, Pat Sullivan, resisted talk of adding sound to his cartoons. Walt Disney, by contrast, was quick to embrace the new technology. He tried a little experiment in which he and his artists showed the still unfinished Steamboat Willie to an audience of their wives and family, while they played musical instruments, including tin pans, slide whistles, and a harmonica, in time to the picture. Disney's little test audience loved it, and when the completed film, Steamboat Willie, was shown in theaters, the effect was electric. Sound did even more for animation than it did for live action. It wasn't only that voices and sound effects made the images on the screen feel more real, although it certainly did that. It was also that animated characters like Mickey Mouse could move to the beat of the music in a way that no live actor could match. Animation plus music equaled a whole new medium. The point was driven home when Walt hired a musician to create soundtrack music for the already completed Plane Crazy and Gallopin' Gaucho. Those films had been animated with no thought for music, and in those films, the magic just wasn't there. The music seemed like an afterthought, which it was. Disney and his staff worked out a system for assigning musical beats to frames of the film, making it possible to animate the characters strictly to the rhythm of music that hadn't been composed yet. To create these musical scores for the first 2 Mickey Mouse cartoons, Disney reached back to his old circle of friends in Kansas City once more and tapped a 36-year-old movie theater organist named Carl Stalling. Carl's parents were German immigrants. Carl himself was a skilled musician who landed his first job as a silent film piano accompanist in his hometown movie theater in Lexington, Missouri, when he was just 12 years old. As an adult, Stalling played theater organs in big movie houses in Kansas City, theaters so big that the sound of a piano wouldn't have been enough. Stalling had a gift for improvising film music that incorporated quotations from popular music. If the characters in the film went for a ride in a car, Stalling might play a few bars of "In My Merry Oldsmobile," that kind of thing. Stalling even developed a knack for using the various sounds the organ could produce to improvise sound effects for the film. Steamboat Willie was a sensation, and it revolutionized animation. And overnight, Mickey Mouse replaced Felix the Cat as America's animated superstar. Meanwhile, Carl Stalling had proposed another kind of animated film, one that would start with the music track, then the animators would create a cartoon to go with the music. He even had an idea for the first entry: skeletons dancing in a graveyard. The film that developed from that idea, The Skeleton Dance, marked a departure from cartoon conventions in many ways, besides the manner in which it was created. There were no familiar characters and no plot, just 4 human skeletons doing a creepy dance, although there is plenty of comedy, climaxing in the moment when one skeleton plays the spine of another as if it were a xylophone, using bones as hammers, the movements timed perfectly to the music of an actual xylophone. The Skeleton Dance was the first of 75 animated short films released as part of a series titled Silly Symphonies, which aptly sums them up. Disney was always pushing for higher quality animation, which kept raising costs. On the other hand, his cartoons were hugely popular, which made him feel entitled to ask for more money to produce them. In 1930, he again had a falling out with his new distributor. This one, once again, chose to allow his contract with Disney to expire and poach Disney's employees. This time, though, the distributor successfully poached Ub Iwerks, Disney's most talented animator. Carl Stalling went as well, thinking that the Disney studio would not survive without Iwerks. But it did. Although 1931 was a tough year for Walt Disney, but Mickey Mouse carried him through the bad times. Until this moment, motion pictures were almost always presented in black and white. People were experimenting with color still photography in the late 19th century, and the first process to make color motion pictures was developed in Britain in 1908 under the name Kinemacolor. The second was developed in the United States in 1914 under the name Technicolor, which was the name of both the process and the company that sold it. These early processes used a 2-color system. Red and green were filmed separately, then combined when the film was projected before an audience. This produced reasonably good results, including realistic skin tones, as long as you were willing to overlook the absence of blue from the scene. In Hollywood of the 1920s, a few all-color films were made using Technicolor. Other films incorporated color sequences into a film that was otherwise black and white, including 1923's The Ten Commandments and 1925's The Phantom of the Opera. When talking pictures came in, studios embraced not only sound, but color. This was particularly true of Warner Brothers, which had advanced from a second-tier studio to a major studio after pioneering sound. In the period from 1928 to 31, a number of color talking films were released, still using that 2-color Technicolor process. Many were ready to predict that all movies would be in color within a few years. In 1932, Technicolor introduced a full 3-color process that could produce the full range of colors on screen. But it was expensive. And by then, the Great Depression was forcing film studios to cut back on production costs. And for the next 20 years, black and white feature films would remain common, with color reserved for big-budget productions. It would not be until the motion picture industry began to feel the effects of competition from television that color feature films would become the norm. As was the case with sound, Walt Disney was an early adopter of color animation. In fact, when the 3-color Technicolor process was first made available in 1932, Disney signed a 3-year exclusive contract with the company, meaning that Disney would be producing the only full-color animated films in the business, while other animation houses would be stuck with black and white, or at best with an inferior color process. At the 5th Academy Awards ceremony in 1932, Walt Disney would be awarded his first 2 Academy Awards. The first ever Best Animated Short Film for Flowers and Trees, the first Technicolor Silly Symphony cartoon, and a special honorary award for the creation of Mickey Mouse. Over his career, Walt Disney would be nominated for 59 Academy Awards in 6 categories and would win the award 22 times. No one else has ever come close. In the 1930s alone, Disney would win the award for Best Animated Short Film every year for 8 years straight. In 1933, Disney released a Technicolor Silly Symphony with music by Carl Stalling titled The Three Little Pigs, based on an English fable. Originally, they were pixies, not pigs. Anyway, the Disney version was a huge success. The 3 pigs look the same, but you can tell them apart by their clothes and their behavior, making this some of the sharpest characterization to date in an animated film. But the success of the film also has to be credited to an original song, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf, written by Frank Churchill. The song struck a chord in the America of 1933 when the New Deal was at last turning around the U.S. economy, and it became a hit single. The Silly Symphonies cartoons did okay, but the Mickey Mouse cartoons were a phenomenal success. Mickey's popularity soared well beyond even the heights achieved by the now neglected Felix the Cat. By 1932, movie theater marquees announced the exhibition of the latest Mickey Mouse cartoon above the title of the feature film it was showing with. But Mickey's success created new problems. The early Mickey Mouse was something of a rascal. He drank, he smoked, he pulled the cat's tail. Mickey had been intended as a character to entertain general audiences, but a cartoon mouse naturally became the favorite of children. When parents took their kids along to the movies, typically the kids would like the cartoon best of all, and so concerns began to be heard that Mickey's behavior was a bad influence on children. I think this was probably the first time such a concern was raised over a cartoon character, but it certainly will not be the last. Disney and his studio responded to the criticism by making Mickey a gentler fellow, less rough around the edges. But this created a new problem. One hesitates to criticize a beloved icon, but the fact is that Mickey just doesn't have much personality, and to the extent he did, it was the lovable rascal who pulled the cat's tail. If you take that away, what's left? So the studio gave Mickey a cast of supporting characters who could play off him. A girlfriend, Minnie Mouse, a dog, Pluto the Pup, an antagonist, Peg-Leg Pete, and Clarabelle Cow and Horace Horsecollar, and of course, music and Technicolor, as in Mickey's 1935 film The Band Concert, his first color film, and one in which music plays as large a role as it does in the Silly Symphony series. The Band Concert also features Donald Duck, a character who originated in a Silly Symphony and transitioned over into Mickey Mouse's world. Donald Duck very much has a personality, a bit of a rascal, a bit of a prankster, a voice that is only barely intelligible, but most of all, a hair-triggered temper that can result in an explosive tantrum. By the late 30s, Donald would supplant Mickey as Disney's most popular character. I should also note another character who began in supporting roles in Disney cartoons, an air-headed canine, the animators originally called Dippy Dog among themselves, who would eventually be christened Goofy and become another supporting character in Mickey Mouse's world. The trio of Mickey, Donald, and Goofy would dominate cartoon shorts for the next few years, often with Pluto added in, and with Mickey often reduced to merely the straight man for his eccentric colleagues. After Disney lost his second distributor, Columbia took on his cartoons. Later, Disney would jump to United Artists and then to RKO Pictures. The quality of his films continued to improve, and so did the costs. In 1930, the films cost $5,000 each. In 1932, it was approaching $15,000. The Three Little Pigs cost $60,000. By late in the decade, costs were approaching $100,000 per short film. Disney himself had stopped doing the animation work in the late 20s, leading to some unkind accusations that he never was much of an artist in the first place. This is not true. He was never the best artist in his own studio, but he was perfectly capable. It turned out that Walt's real talents lay in organizing the studio. He had a knack for identifying which artists were strongest in which skills and assigning them appropriately. His was the first studio to separate the development of a story from the animation process. Scripts were circulated around the studio and everyone invited to contribute ideas. Then a storyboard would be developed, a series of pencil sketches that would summarize the plot of the film, something like a comic strip. Disney was the first animation studio to use this technique, which later became the standard in the industry. Disney was one of the first animation studios to actually train its animators. Most animators of the time were self-taught and came into the field out of a love of animated cartoons. Their comparative rarity is what made it possible for other studios to steal animators away from each other again and again. And perhaps it was those experiences that drove Disney to create training programs to develop new animators himself. Artists were put to work breaking down live-action films, including many old Charlie Chaplin films, to analyze the movement. Disney held drawing classes in the studio and sponsored field trips to the zoo, where the animators could practice sketching animals. No one compares to Walt Disney in terms of his influence on the art of animation. At his peak, he defined animation and left artists at other animation studios scratching their heads and studying his work for some clue on how to duplicate it. Disney's animation also carries the stamp of Disney's own middle American values and perhaps also reflects his own less-than-perfect childhood. His creations are lush, lovely, wholesome, perhaps to a fault, and depict a world far more inviting than the one he grew up in as a boy, a world in which anything your heart desires may come to you, and there is always, always a happy ending. Disney's influence reaches far beyond the world of animation and is in fact a powerful force in shaping the larger American culture, and more than any other American artist, shaping the image of America in the eyes of the world. Animated short films, shown along with feature films in movie theaters, were hugely popular in the 1930s and would continue through the 1940s and 1950s before disappearing in the 1960s. During the 30s, Walt Disney was the absolute king of short animated films. Other animators studied his work and tried to match it, or at least put their own spin on it. Some of these competing films are largely forgotten, but there are other cartoons from other studios of this era still fondly remembered in our time. In last week's episode, I mentioned the animator Max Fleischer, who worked for John Bray. In the 20s, Fleischer partnered with Lee DeForest, among others, and pioneered sound in cartoons. It was Fleischer who first created sing-along films using the follow-the-bouncing-ball method of coaching the audience on the lyrics. By the end of the decade, Fleischer was running his own animation studio, producing cartoons for Paramount Pictures. The most famous original character to come out of Fleischer Studios has to be Betty Boop, who starred in about 90 cartoon shorts in the 1930s. Betty Boop is a parody of a flapper from the 1920s, a woman who combines a certain childlike innocence with a degree of sexuality clearly not intended for children. Betty Boop cartoons were filmed in black and white, and the series and the character suffered when other cartoons went color. Betty Boop was all but forgotten by 1950, although the character was eventually rediscovered and embraced by a new generation of fans later in the century. From Betty Boop, Fleischer moved on to animating the Popeye comic strip character, and these proved to be the most successful comic strip to film adaptations of all time. In 1941, Fleischer would make the first animated, also the first motion picture adaptation of a comic book superhero, Superman, just 3 years after the character was first introduced. I also mentioned Walter Lantz last time. He got his start with Bray and took over the animation division when Bray moved on to instructional films. After distributor Charles Mintz took over animating the character Oswald the Lucky Rabbit from that other Walter, Lantz went to work for him. When Universal Pictures, the distributor, became unhappy with the cartoons Mintz was producing, they decided to animate the character themselves and hired Walter Lantz to do it. In 1935, Lantz created his own animation studio, and Universal contracted with him to produce Oswald cartoons, but by that time the character had lost popularity to Disney and other newer cartoons, so Lantz set to work developing new cartoon characters, including Andy Panda and a penguin named Chilly Willy, but his most famous character was spun off from an Andy Panda cartoon, a pesky bird with a signature grating laugh named Woody Woodpecker. Lantz would continue to make Woody Woodpecker cartoons for film and television until his retirement in 1972. One last big name I have to mention from 1930s animation is Leon Schlesinger, born in 1884 in Philadelphia. From an early age, Leon took an interest in the business end of theater. After the Great War, he opened an art studio in Hollywood, and this studio produced the intertitle cards for silent films. It's worth noting that these silent film intertitles were a lot more than just words on a screen. They were laid out in certain ways, with certain font choices, and often with artwork in the margins, making them part of the storytelling and the artistry of the film. Schlesinger developed a close business relationship with the Warner Brothers studio. He even invested some of his own money in the production of The Jazz Singer. In the early 30s, he would produce 6 live-action westerns for Warner Brothers, starring an up-and-coming young film actor born Marion Morrison, better known by his screen name, John Wayne. Remember when I told you distributor Charles Mintz took the character Oswald the Lucky Rabbit away from Walt Disney and stole most of his animators to boot? That was in 1928. And then remember when I told you that Universal Pictures became unhappy with Mince's animation studio? They brought the character in-house and hired Walter Lantz to do the animation. That was in 1929. The animators who left Disney for Mince now found themselves unemployed. But then came Steamboat Willie, which demonstrated the potential of animation with sound. And here were these animators, Disney veterans, looking for work. Two of them, Hugh Harman and Rudy Ising, put together their own animation studio and created a 3-minute animated film with sound and incorporating an original character, and titled it Bosco the Talk Ink Kid. They shopped their demonstration film around in Hollywood. Most of the major studios already had a cartoon series under contract, but Leon Schlesinger became interested in the project and sold it to Warner Brothers. Now, Warner Brothers, having made their big splash with the jazz singer, were quick to recognize the value in owning a music publishing business. That way, Warner's would own the rights to a number of popular songs, which they could easily incorporate into their pictures. They bought up several music publishers and acquired the copyrights to a substantial library of songs. In fact, Warner's was soon earning millions of dollars in income every year on its music licensing business alone. They also bought a record company, Brunswick Records, but that didn't pay off so well. The 1-2 punch of the rise of radio and the Great Depression hit the record business hard, and Warner's soon sold off their recording business. But when Leon Schlesinger made his pitch to Warner's, they saw a lucrative opportunity. They signed a deal with him to make these cartoons, but added a requirement that every one of the cartoons include a chorus from one of the songs in the Warner's library. Since Warner's was using these same songs in their musical feature films, this would mean every cartoon short would also be a commercial for a song owned by Warner Brothers and a film released by Warner Brothers. Hollywood deal-making at its finest. Harman and Ising came up with the name Looney Tunes for this new series of cartoons. The title, as you can see, is a blatant ripoff of Walt Disney's Silly Symphonies, though the contrast between symphonies and tunes reflects that these cartoons would be playing popular music, while Disney's tastes leaned more toward light classical. And even though the name Looney Tunes was a blatant ripoff, the name and the series became beloved in their own right, and indeed are better remembered today than are the Silly Symphonies. For a time, the phrase Looney Tunes became an American colloquialism as a synonym for crazy, as in, that last idea of hers was Looney Tunes. By the way, I feel obligated to point out that in our time, cartoon characters are sometimes referred to colloquially as toons, T-O-O-N-S, but the tune in Looney Tunes is spelled T-U-N-E. The name does not refer to the characters as loony, it is saying the tunes are interpreted in a loony way. The first Looney Tunes cartoon was released in May 1930. It was called Sinkin' in the Bathtub, which is, of course, a play on Singing in the Bathtub, a song that was written the previous year, copyright Warner Brothers, and was performed in Warner Brothers' 1929 musical review film, The Show of Shows. The song was written as a parody of Singin' in the Rain, also written in 1929 for the MGM musical, The Hollywood Review of 1929. And, as you already know, it will be repurposed as the title song in a 1952 MGM musical. This song, Singing in the Bathtub, will also be repurposed again and again in Warner Brothers cartoon shorts, a total of 18 times, most often sung by Bugs Bunny or Tweety Bird, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Sinkin' in the Bathtub features Bosco, Harman and Ising's original character, and his girlfriend, Honey. Bosco takes Honey on a date, and that's about all there is for plot. But there are songs and gags along the way. The design for the characters of Bosco and Honey were hardly original. They were all black with big white eyes and white around the mouth to allow the artists room for facial expressions. In other words, they looked very much the same as Felix the Cat, or Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, or Mickey Mouse. Only, what was Bosco, anyway? Or, as one African-American Warner Brothers employee asked one of the animators, I know Mickey Mouse and Crazy Cat and Oswald the Rabbit, but Bosco the what? In fact, it's hard not to conclude that Bosco is meant to be an African-American boy and Honey an African-American girl. Bosco sometimes spoke in stereotypical African-American vernacular English, and one of the actors who voiced him was the African-American child actor Billy Thomas, who would later play the character Buckwheat in Hal Roach's Our Gang comedy shorts. The presentation of Bosco and Honey can be offensive by today's standards, although it's worth pointing out that Bosco is the protagonist of these films. The audience is meant to like him and root for him, and he was a reasonably popular character over about 3 years and 24 films. But the Bosco cartoons contained nothing very new or very original at a time when Disney was wowing them with every new release. So they are not fondly remembered today. Still, Looney Tunes was successful enough that Warner Brothers wanted to buy a second cartoon series. Harmon and Ising suggested a series of one-off cartoons, each based on a Warner Brothers song, similar to Disney's Silly Symphonies. This series would be called Merry Melodies. Leon Schlesinger was famously tight-fisted with the budgets. In 1933, Harmon and Ising demanded more money per cartoon. Schlesinger refused, and they quit, taking Bosco and Honey with them. They would find a new home at MGM. MGM was one of the top film studios in Hollywood of the time, but they had been slow to recognize the advantage of having an in-house line of cartoon shorts to go with their features. Hiring Harmon and Ising was a step meant to kickstart MGM's own cartoon line, but I'm running out of time for today, so I'll have to punt that story to a future episode. Meanwhile, over at Warner's, Leon Schlesinger was now in the position of having solid contracts for his studio, but no one to do the animation work. He solved this problem in the now traditional fashion of raiding animators from other studios. He managed to woo two away from Harmon and Ising, two fellows named Bob Clampett and Friz Freleng, whom we have already met. Clampett was put in charge of making Looney Tunes, while Freleng took over the production of Merry Melodies. The first Merry Melodies cartoons were well received, and with Disney going color, Schlesinger felt he had no choice but to follow suit. Since Disney held exclusive rights to the Technicolor 3-color process for now, Schlesinger began making Merry Melodies with the older 2-color process, which wasn't as vivid, but still it gave Merry Melodies a leg up on the rest of the competition. Looney Tunes would not go color until 1942. These early Merry Melodies, though popular in their time, are not fondly remembered today either. Typically, they took a Warner Brothers song and animated it to Dancing Flowers or Dancing Bugs or Dancing Goods on a Store Shelf. It was clever and charming the first time you saw one, but it got old after the 6th or 7th time. The turning point for Schlesinger's studio came in 1935, when an animator who worked for Walter Lantz decided to apply for a better job with Schlesinger, presenting himself as an experienced animation director. Schlesinger decided to take a chance on him. He had 2 units going already, one making Looney Tunes and the other making Merry Melodies. Schlesinger offered this applicant, who was named Fred Avery, but liked to go by Tex Avery. He offered Tex Avery the chance to head a 3rd animation team. Schlesinger had a few animators who were restless, who weren't satisfied with what they were doing, who were getting bored, including Bob Clampett and Chuck Jones. Avery and this crew were assigned quarters in a dilapidated bungalow on the Warner's lot that the artists dubbed Termite Terrace. And there they got together to make something special, these restless artists who weren't satisfied to crank out more and more of the same old thing. Schlesinger was tight with the budgets, but he gave his artists full creative control. As long as they delivered the cartoon on time and on budget, they had wide latitude to let their imaginations run wild. Avery reviewed the older cartoons and came across a Merry Melodies short that included in its cast a pig with a stutter named Porky. And he made this fellow the everyman protagonist of his new line of cartoons. Porky Pig got a girlfriend, Petunia Pig, and they became the house versions of Mickey and Minnie Mouse. What Avery brought to the animation table was speed, an element previously rare in animation. Speed as in characters moving so fast they were visible only as a blur, or simply vanish, leaving behind only a puff of smoke. Not only did these characters move faster, but so did the films themselves. His cartoons became famous for their rapid-fire edits, sometimes as many as 10 cuts in a 7-second clip of film. If Porky and Petunia Pig were Schlesinger's Mickey and Minnie Mouse, what they still needed was a Donald Duck. The year 1937 saw the introduction of a little black duck named Daffy Duck to fill that role. If Donald's thing was temper tantrums, Daffy's thing was, well, being Daffy, zipping all over the scene in that distinctive Tex Avery way and driving Porky crazy. Apart from the rapid movement and quick cutting, another distinguishing feature of these Warner's cartoons was their self-referential humor. These characters were aware that they were cartoons. They often faced the fourth wall and addressed the theater audience directly. They referred to themselves as stars and sometimes argued among themselves over which of them was the most popular. The epitome of this sort of thing has got to be the 1940 short You Ought to Be in Pictures, one of the rare Warner's shorts to combine animation with live action. Daffy Duck persuades Porky Pig that Porky has gotten too big for cartoons and should be in feature films as Bette Davis's leading man. Porky goes to the boss, Leon Schlesinger, playing himself, and asks to be let out of his contract so he can pursue his dream. Schlesinger agrees, they shake hands, and Porky is off. Schlesinger turns to the camera and tells the audience knowingly, "He'll be back." What follows is Porky's misadventures in the real-life Warner Brothers studio lot, while Daffy Duck now visits Schlesinger and makes his pitch that, "I'm a better actor than he ever was. Porky never did anything. I did all the work." Schlesinger resists Daffy's entreaties long enough for Porky to realize his mistake and come running back to Looney Tunes, just as Schlesinger predicted. The late 1930s also saw the gradual introduction of a pesky rabbit character. This fellow, who was cribbed from a Disney short, made a number of appearances beginning as an antagonist to Porky Pig, just as Daffy had. But the early versions of this character were just Daffy Duck with ears and a cottontail. He wouldn't come into his own until the artist came up with a suitable foil for him. This character emerged from a 1940 Chuck Jones short titled Elmer's Candid Camera. The new character was named Elmer Fudd, with a distinctive voice provided by radio actor Arthur Q. Bryan. In his first short, Elmer merely wanted a photograph of the rabbit. He stumbles on Wabbit Twax, but the rabbit is spectacularly uncooperative and leaves Elmer in frustration. Tex Avery followed up on this promising beginning with A Wild Hare, also in 1940. Elmer is now a hunter and opens the film by addressing the audience directly, requesting them to be very, very quiet. I'm hunting rabbits. Soon he finds his quarry, raises his shotgun, but the rabbit is nonplussed. He greets Elmer, for the first time but hardly the last, with a calm, inquisitive, "What's up, Doc?" Hijinks ensue, culminating in the rabbit playing out an elaborate death scene. "I can't hold out much longer. Everything's getting dark," which reduces Elmer to tears. Of course, it's fake. The rabbit kicks Elmer in the rear, leaving the frustrated hunter to return home empty-handed. A wise guy rabbit who lives in the forest but speaks with a Brooklyn accent, suggesting this is no country rube of a bunny, but a sophisticated city rabbit. The genius of Bugs Bunny is that he's a loon and a prankster, just like the two ducks, Donald or Daffy. But unlike them, the targets of his mischief fully deserve what they get. Bugs never kicks the butt of an innocent victim. All he wants is to be left alone in his luxuriously appointed rabbit hole. The problem is always caused by someone else, especially Elmer Fudd, trespassing onto Bugs's turf and trying to ruin his day. Even then, Bugs often lets the first offense slide, sometimes even the second, before deciding to wreak his vengeance, a decision that is typically announced directly to the audience with the words, "Of course you realize this means war." The fact that Bugs is always first provoked means he always has the audience's sympathy, no matter how over the top his revenge. Bugs Bunny would become Warner Brothers' most famous and most popular cartoon character, and perhaps the most sophisticated and well-rounded character as a character in animation history. Bugs emerged from the Merry Melodies line of cartoons, and for a time, Bugs was the star of that series, and Porky and Daffy the stars of Looney Tunes, but soon there was spillover, and by 1944, the two series were interchangeable except for the titles and theme music. By 1937, The Merry-Go-Round Broke Down was established as the theme song for Looney Tunes, while Merry Melodies were introduced with the tune Merrily We Roll Along. And speaking of music, I can't wrap this up without mentioning Carl Stalling one more time. In 1936, Stalling began composing the music scores for Schlesinger's cartoons. Remember, by this time, Schlesinger had 3 different teams, each producing a short film every 4 weeks, or 39 short films per year, and Stalling created the score for just about every one of them for 22 years, until his retirement in 1958. Over 600 scores in all. Warner's wanted their music featured in the cartoons, and boy did Stalling give it to them. Rapid-fire quotations of popular tunes from the Warner's library were a hallmark of Stalling's scores, employed in a way that commented on the action, harkening back to Stalling's days as a movie theater organist improvising accompaniments to silent films. If the characters ran off in a hurry, the music would play California, Here I Come. If Bugs Bunny dressed in drag to fool Elmer Fudd, the music played Oh You Beautiful Gal. If food was in any way involved, the music played A Cup of Coffee, A Sandwich, and You. If the animation had quick cuts and shifted pace rapidly, so did the score. Stalling's scores included trademark musical sound effects, such as xylophone chords when a character blinked. Warner's allowed Schlesinger and Stalling the use of their 50-piece studio orchestra, which was normally used for feature film scores, and Stalling took full advantage of it. The lush sound of the musical accompaniment became as much a part of these cartoons as Bugs chewing on a carrot, Porky Pig stuttering, or sticks of dynamite. The musicians reported that playing one of Stalling's 6-minute scores was far more demanding than performing the score for a feature film. And I told you that Arthur Q. Bryan provided the voice for Elmer Fudd, so I couldn't possibly wrap up this episode without mentioning Leon Schlesinger's principal voice actor, radio performer Mel Blanc, who was both acting and creating sound effects for a number of radio shows in the 1930s, most notably Jack Benny's radio show, on which he portrayed various characters and provided the sound effects for Benny's famously old and broken down 1923 Maxwell automobile. Mel Blanc began working for Leon Schlesinger in 1936. Tex Avery in particular loved his voice work, and soon he was providing the voice for Porky Pig. Later, he originated the voice roles of Daffy Duck and then Bugs Bunny. In 1944, Blanc became the first animated film voice actor to receive on-screen credit for his voice characterizations. He later explained that he asked for the credit after the famously tight-fisted Leon Schlesinger refused his request for a raise. And as Walt Disney drifted away from short films to focus on feature-length animation, Warner Brothers would rise to become the most artistically and technically advanced studio for short cartoons, although soon MGM is going to be nipping at their heels. But that, as I already said, is a story for some other episode. We'll have to stop there for today. I thank you for listening, and I'd especially like to thank David and Goran for their kind donations. And thank you to Anna for becoming a patron of the podcast. Donors and patrons like David and Goran and Anna help cover the costs of making this show, which in turn keeps the podcast available free for everyone. So my thanks to them and to all of you who have pitched in and helped out. If you'd like to become a patron or make a donation, just visit the website historyofthe20thcentury.com and click on the PayPal or Patreon buttons. The podcast website also contains notes about the music used on the podcast. Sometimes it's my own work, sometimes it's licensed, but many times the music you hear here is free and downloadable. So, if you hear a piece of music on this podcast and you would like to know more about it, including the composer, the performers, and a link to where you can download it, that would be the place to go. While you're there, you can leave a comment and let me know what you thought about today's show. And I hope you'll join me next week here on the History of the 20th Century as we turn our attention to South America and the biggest war of the 20th century you never heard of. The War of Thirst, next week, here on the History of the 20th Century. Oh, and one more thing. Leon Schlesinger died in 1949 at the age of 65. In 1944, he had sold his animation business to Warner Brothers, which operated it in-house as Warner Brothers Cartoons until 1964, when they shut down their animation operation. Fortunately, that decision was temporary, and the revived studio, now called Warner Brothers Animation, is still in business in our time.